Your spirit quietly molds every habit you practice when no one is watching, and your habits quietly construct the life you eventually walk into, whether you are aware of it or not. Every choice made in silence becomes a seed planted in the atmosphere of your future, growing without your permission, because growth follows the law of repetition, not the law of intention. When a person chooses to pray in bed, half awake, drifting between thoughts and sleep, the mind learns to treat the sacred as casual, the holy as familiar, and the divine as optional. You begin to train your spirit that connection with God can be approached with divided focus, wandering emotions, and unfocused attention, and this weakens the authority of your inner life. The spiritual realm responds to order, depth, and intentionality, not to lazy habits that dilute reverence. When this becomes normal, a person unknowingly strips themselves of spiritual sharpness and sensitivity, slowly disconnecting from clarity, direction, and discernment. The posture of your body leaks into the posture of your spirit, and the posture of your spirit leaks into the decisions you make, the battles you win, and the temptations you overcome. This is why a careless prayer life becomes a doorway to deeper struggles, because what begins as a physical position eventually becomes a spiritual condition. In the same quiet spaces where prayer becomes careless, physical habits also begin to form their own patterns, shaping thoughts, emotions, and desires more powerfully than people realize. What you repeatedly do in secret writes instructions into the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind obeys without questioning, without resisting, and without analyzing whether the habit is beneficial or destructive. When someone indulges in private habits, especially sexual habits done as an escape, a distraction, or a reflex, they slowly lose authority over themselves, often without recognizing the shift taking place. It begins subtly as a moment of release meant to relieve stress or loneliness, but repeated daily, it becomes a program that drains discipline, weakens focus, and creates a quiet dependency that shapes the emotional body. This quiet dependency becomes a magnetic pull, turning into cycles of craving and relief that keep the mind trapped in a loop of temporary comfort. The spiritual cost of this cycle is far greater than the physical one, because anything that becomes a master over your attention eventually becomes a master over your destiny. A man cannot rise with clarity while bound to impulses that quietly rob him of energy, confidence, creativity, and inner authority. Your destiny requires a level of mental purity and emotional strength that cannot coexist with habits that drain your inner fire. And this is why every private action matters more than every public declaration you make. People often speak boldly about transformation and spiritual power, but their private patterns tell a different story, revealing the true direction of their inner life. When you repeatedly engage in habits that provide quick pleasure, your mind becomes conditioned to choose comfort over growth, indulgence over discipline, and stimulation over purpose. This silent conditioning affects every aspect of life: your decisions, your confidence, your relationships, and even your ability to hear divine guidance with clarity. The subconscious mind cannot pursue greatness while being trained daily to chase short-term satisfaction. The spirit cannot burn with passion when the body is constantly drained by cycles of gratification that offer emotional release but steal spiritual strength. When this imbalance forms, a person may outwardly appear strong, devoted, or focused, but inwardly they feel tired, scattered, disconnected, and unable to maintain consistent spiritual momentum. The fragmentation created by these habits breaks the unity between spirit, mind, and body, and this division weakens every area of life, making progress feel heavy, delayed, and unpredictable. This is why the discipline of your physical body directly influences the strength of your spiritual life, because the body is the vehicle through which your spirit expresses its authority on earth. When the body is undisciplined, the spirit cannot fully express power, direction, or clarity, no matter how much a person desires transformation. Every great destiny demands mastery over impulses, not because the impulses are evil, but because unmastered impulses become chains that bind the soul to smallness. Your purpose requires you to rise above any behavior that teaches your mind to bow to comfort instead of conviction. When you stand up to pray intentionally, you teach your spirit to awaken, to engage, to listen, and to command your atmosphere with authority. When you discipline your physical habits, especially in private, you restore inner strength, rebuild confidence, and create a reservoir of energy that fuels spiritual power. The man who learns to govern the body becomes unstoppable in spirit, because nothing weakens his focus, steals his clarity, or interrupts his alignment. Every moment of discipline becomes a declaration to heaven that you are ready for greater responsibility, deeper revelation, and higher purpose. And heaven always responds to those who honor themselves enough to live with intention, purity, and mastery. When a person allows prayer to drift into a state of casual half-consciousness, the inner senses begin to lose sharpness, and the spiritual atmosphere around them becomes dull and unfocused. Prayer is not meant to be a sleepy whisper from the comfort of a pillow, but a deliberate engagement of the spirit with the divine, a moment where you rise in intention and present your heart with clarity and honor. When prayer becomes something you do in bed simply because it is easy, convenient, or comfortable, you unknowingly teach your mind that sacred moments do not require effort, and this weakens your spiritual posture. Over time, this creates a subtle disconnection, a quiet erosion of passion and alertness, making it harder to discern guidance, resist temptation, or maintain spiritual authority. The spirit responds to hunger, not habit, to intentionality, not indifference, to focus, not fatigue. And when the physical body is placed in a posture of sleep, the spirit often follows that same posture, sinking into a state of passivity that affects everything from your emotional strength to your clarity of purpose. A person who spiritually sleeps cannot command their life with power, because spiritual sleep produces emotional confusion, scattered thoughts, and weakened discipline. This is the danger of casual prayer. It creates a lifestyle of spiritual passivity. In the same way, when physical indulgence becomes a habit, especially indulgence rooted in secrecy or emotional escape, the mind slowly begins to depend on the pleasure rather than on purpose. The danger is not simply the act, it is the repetition, the consistency, the quiet cycle that forms when a person turns to the body for relief instead of addressing the deeper hunger of the spirit. Sexual self-stimulation becomes a trap when it shifts from occasional relief to daily ritual, because what is daily becomes identity, and what becomes identity shapes a person's emotional landscape. The body may release tension momentarily, but the cycle trains the mind to crave stimulation instead of self-mastery, comfort instead of courage, distraction instead of healing. The more frequently a person turns to these habits, the more disconnected they become from their true power, because their emotional energy is being used to relieve pressure instead of creating change. This creates a pattern where the inner fire is slowly extinguished and replaced by dependency on momentary pleasure, which never truly satisfies the deeper longing for purpose, connection, and strength. The danger is not visible to the eye. It is emotional, mental, and spiritual, slowly draining the authority a person needs to rise into their calling. When prayer becomes passive and physical indulgence becomes frequent, a dangerous mixture forms, one that affects the entire structure of a person's inner life. Prayer is meant to awaken the spirit, sharpen the mind, and strengthen the will, but when done carelessly, it does the opposite. Physical habits are meant to be governed by wisdom and balance, but when done excessively, they reshape desires and weaken discipline. Together, these two forces create an internal conflict where the spirit desires depth, but the body desires indulgence, and the mind stands confused between the two. In this state, people lose the ability to maintain focus, consistency, or spiritual fire, because their energy is being divided between two opposing directions. The person begins to feel spiritually numb, emotionally unstable, and mentally scattered, not recognizing that the issue is not a lack of calling, but a lack of alignment. When the physical body is indulged and the spiritual body is neglected, the entire inner system collapses under the weight of imbalance. You cannot walk in clarity while your habits pull you into distraction, and you cannot walk in power while your private life weakens your authority. Physical indulgence also carries emotional consequences that people rarely acknowledge, because the cycle is quiet, private, and easy to hide, yet deeply influential. When the body becomes accustomed to daily stimulation, the emotional body becomes unstable, constantly seeking release to cope with stress, boredom, anxiety, or loneliness. This creates an emotional dependency that weakens a person's resilience, making them more reactive, less focused, and less able to delay gratification. When combined with passive prayer, the person's inner strength collapses further, because their spirit is not receiving the nourishment needed to counterbalance these emotional fluctuations. The result is a weakened will, a person who wants change but cannot command themselves, who desires freedom but feels pulled back into the same cycles, who dreams of spiritual depth but lives in physical distraction. The true danger is not in the pleasure itself, but in what the pleasure replaces: discipline, confidence, clarity, and spiritual sensitivity. These losses are far more destructive than the habit itself, because they affect every area of a person's life, from relationships to self-esteem to their sense of purpose. To overcome this mixture of spiritual passivity and physical indulgence, a person must reclaim the authority of their mind and the posture of their spirit. The body must be placed under discipline, not ignored or shamed, but guided by purpose rather than impulse. The mind must be retrained to seek fulfillment in growth, strength, and clarity, not in cycles of temporary comfort. Prayer must return to a place of honor, structure, and intention, not casual whispers offered from the comfort of a bed, but deliberate moments of connection that awaken the spirit. When the physical body is disciplined and the spiritual body is engaged with passion, the emotional body stabilizes, the mind sharpens, and the entire inner system aligns. A person who rises in this alignment becomes powerful, focused, and sensitive to spiritual truth. They rise above impulses, above cycles, above cravings, and above confusion. Discipline becomes freedom, clarity becomes strength, and purpose becomes fuel. The danger is real, but so is the power to rise above it. When the spirit leads, the mind obeys, and the body follows. Every action you repeat becomes an instruction written directly into the subconscious mind, shaping who you are becoming even when you are not aware of it. The subconscious does not judge, question, or argue. It simply absorbs patterns and reproduces them in your daily life as automatic behavior. When someone constantly prays in a posture of fatigue, distraction, or half-sleep, they program their mind to approach sacred moments with minimal focus and reduced awareness. Over time, this sends a message to the inner system that spiritual matters do not require alertness or intentionality, weakening the ability to connect deeply. The more frequently this pattern occurs, the more numb the spirit becomes to divine impulses, making clarity difficult and sensitivity rare. This is why posture matters, not because God demands a position, but because your subconscious responds to the level of alertness you bring into prayer. The physical state becomes a mirror of the inner state, and the inner state becomes the foundation for every decision you make. A sleepy prayer life produces a sleepy spirit, and a sleepy spirit produces a life governed by drifting instead of direction. In the same way, the habits you repeat in private, especially those tied to physical pleasure, become powerful programs that shape your emotional and mental landscape. When a person engages in daily sexual self-stimulation, the body releases chemicals that create temporary relief, but the subconscious interprets this relief as the easiest pathway to comfort. Over time, the mind becomes conditioned to seek release instead of resilience, pleasure instead of purpose, and momentary stimulation instead of emotional mastery. What begins as an occasional act slowly becomes a programmed pattern that shapes your energy, motivation, and focus. The more it is repeated, the more the subconscious accepts it as part of your identity, creating cravings not from desire, but from the repetition itself. This cycle drains emotional strength because the body is constantly shifting between tension and release without addressing the deeper need for healing, direction, and discipline. Instead of learning to sit with discomfort, the mind learns to escape it, creating a dependency that affects confidence, clarity, and the ability to focus. These patterns weaken the inner system in ways people rarely see but deeply feel. The body responds to repetition with loyalty, and the mind follows whatever the body repeats consistently, whether the habit is empowering or draining. When prayer is done with intention, the mind becomes sharp, the emotions stabilize, and the spirit awakens. But when prayer becomes routine without awareness, it loses its power to transform and begins to feel like a fading obligation rather than a spiritual encounter. At the same time, when the body becomes accustomed to daily release, it interprets stress, boredom, loneliness, or frustration as signals that stimulation is needed again, strengthening the cycle. This becomes a loop where the person oscillates between spiritual passivity and physical craving, never experiencing true clarity or strength. In this state, it becomes difficult to maintain focus, to elevate thinking, or to sustain emotional calm, because the mind is busy fulfilling habits rather than pursuing purpose. The emotional body becomes reactive, more easily shaken by challenges, and more dependent on temporary relief. This internal conflict creates fragmentation, spirit wanting depth, mind wanting discipline, body wanting pleasure, which leaves the person feeling divided within themselves. To rise above these cycles, one must understand the power of alignment between the spirit, the mind, and the body, because they cannot work against each other and still produce a life of strength. When the spirit desires elevation, but the body is trained in indulgence, the mind becomes the battlefield where conflicting desires fight for control. The only way to restore harmony is by reprogramming the subconscious through intentional action, disciplined choices, and sacred focus. When a person stands to pray with alertness, the subconscious receives a new instruction. This moment requires presence, honor, and awareness. When a person reduces compulsive physical habits, the subconscious receives another message. Comfort is not the master, purpose is. Over time, these repeated acts build inner authority, strengthening the emotional body and sharpening the mental one. Slowly, the cravings weaken, the distractions lose power, and the spirit begins to rise with a new sense of clarity and direction. You regain the energy that once leaked into cycles of release and redirect it into growth, passion, creativity, and spiritual strength. Alignment becomes possible, and when alignment comes, everything within you begins to move toward the life you were meant to live. Honor is the foundation upon which spiritual power, mental clarity, and physical strength are built. And the way you treat your moments of prayer determines how deeply that honor is rooted within you. When a person approaches prayer with alertness, intention, and reverence, the subconscious mind begins to understand that these moments carry weight, depth, and meaning. But when prayer is done from a place of laziness, comfort, or distraction, like lying in bed half asleep, the spirit loses the sense of urgency that produces real transformation. Your posture in prayer is not about impressing heaven, but about awakening the inner self, signaling to your entire being that something sacred is happening. When the body is placed in a position that encourages sleep, the spirit follows the same pattern and becomes passive instead of ignited. Over time, this passivity shapes the way you handle challenges, influences your emotional stability, and affects your spiritual discernment. Honor in prayer teaches the mind to rise, teaches the emotions to settle, and teaches the spirit to respond with sensitivity and depth. Without this honor, spiritual clarity becomes dim, and inner authority slowly dissolves. The same principle applies to your physical habits, because the way you treat your body is a direct reflection of the way you treat your purpose. When someone indulges in private physical habits without balance or discipline, especially habits tied to sexual release, the body becomes trained to serve impulse rather than intention. This weakens the mind because the subconscious interprets the behavior as a signal that temporary pleasure is more important than long-term purpose. Over time, this creates a pattern of inner instability, where the person feels drained, unfocused, or emotionally scattered without fully understanding why. The emotional body pays the price for physical indulgence, and the spiritual body loses sensitivity because energy that should have been used for growth is spent on gratification. Honor requires mastery, and mastery requires treating the body as a vessel of purpose rather than an escape from discomfort. When you honor your body by guiding it with discipline, you restore your power, rebuild your confidence, and regain control over the emotional cycles that once dictated your life. This alignment strengthens your spirit and sharpens your mind. The relationship between honor and power becomes visible in the small daily decisions that shape the rhythm of your life. When you rise from your bed to pray instead of whispering a few sleepy words into your pillow, you teach your subconscious that spiritual moments deserve your full presence. This strengthens your inner authority and creates a habit of alertness that spills into every other area of life. When you choose to restrain physical habits instead of indulging them simply because the urge appears, you teach your mind that discipline has more value than impulse. This creates emotional resilience, mental clarity, and spiritual stability, all rooted in the power of honor. Honor is not a feeling. It is a deliberate decision to treat what matters with the highest level of respect. When honor becomes a lifestyle, it restructures the inner world by aligning the body with the mind and the mind with the spirit. This alignment breaks old habits, renews patterns of thinking, and awakens the fire within the soul. When you begin to live with honor spiritually, mentally, and physically, you step into a different kind of existence where impulses lose their power and conviction becomes your guiding force. The man who honors his spiritual life gains discernment because he learns to listen with an awakened heart rather than a distracted mind. The man who honors his body gains strength because the body responds to structure and discipline by creating stability. The man who honors his mind gains clarity because the mind thrives when boundaries replace chaos. This is why honor is the key that unlocks transformation. It teaches your entire being to rise toward purpose rather than sink into patterns that weaken your future. When honor governs your choices, you become capable of seeing opportunities that were once hidden, overcoming temptations that once controlled you, and accessing levels of focus that once seemed impossible. Honor rewrites your identity, strengthens your inner authority, and positions you for a life of purpose, purity, and power.